Hello and welcome. Today the topic is sculpting or the high-res, low-res workflow, which we'll get into. And the topics coming up is, well, sculpting in high-res, low-res, and also a bit of a talk about bumps and normals and displacement maps, and also a look at photogrammetry. But before we go there, I had this picture up before, going from a model to a final render, that's all well, but there's something else also going on between these two renders, which is, well, having a much more detailed model than what we see there, which would be a sculpted, yeah, a sculpt, simply put. And that's sort of the question because, doing wrinkles and models of this type isn't really doable just using normal Maya tools. I mean, if you really, really went for it, you could maybe manage, but we'll have a look at other ways to do that, which is digital sculpting. So, a few words about digital sculpting coming up, and then the process of taking these digital sculpts that we might create in ZBrush. That's sort of the assumption here. And managing them or dealing with them so that they work in a production workflow, which means we probably have a sculpt that will be quite high resolution and we'll need to make a lower resolution version of that, just fewer polygons essentially. And that causes all kinds of interesting uh, issues. So that's a topic coming up. Uh, I know I have already asked you to watch a video about bumps, normals, and displacement maps, but I would like to add a few comments to that topic as well. And then a little bit about photogrammetry or using just a normal camera to scan 3D objects or, well, actual objects and make 3D models from them. And again, as usual, an expected reading portion, which, it might be worth checking this one out first or last. I'm not quite sure, whatever makes most sense to you. So, starting out with digital sculpting. Let's have a look. So, number one, what this video or this lecture sort of is about organic modeling, really. Or a term you'll find quite often mentioned when it comes to sculpting and such is the division of shapes between hard surface and organic. And Maya is great to create certain kinds of sort of hard surface models. And precisely what is hard surface and what is not hard surface is sometimes sort of it's not an exact science. To me, basically, hard surface means I can do it in Maya, and organic means I might not really have the tools to do it in Maya. And if we want to do something like a photorealistic head or Godzilla, then Maya won't really cut it. And by the way, like the actual Godzilla, this is a video or a presentation about literally how they made Godzilla, if you're wondering. So that's interesting. Uh, so yeah, Maya for stuff like this, Maya might work just perfectly fine. If we stretch Maya quite a bit, it can maybe also help us do things like this, although we can also do that in ZBrush. But again, for Godzilla, we'll need something else because these kinds of details just aren't doable. And that's where ZBrush and other sculpting tools come in. Now, we have ZBrush, so pretty much assume that we use ZBrush, but just for completion's sake, there's also, there's other tools to do this. Maya does have, like, I should put Maya in a really tiny corner. Maya has sculpting tools that sometimes they can be useful for certain type of tasks, like maybe doing blend shapes and stuff like that. But I wouldn't really use them to sculpt models from scratch. Another sort of one of the main contenders with ZBrush, at least a few years ago, was Mudbox, Autodesk's own Mudbox. And well, just fun fact, Blender is also quite capable sculpting program. Of course, there's more, but these are maybe some of the key ones you'll be hearing about every now and then. But again, ZBrush sort of is maybe the most advanced, but also most well, therefore most powerful version of them all. Now, the basic idea underlying all sculpting software, really, at least originally, is subdivision. So this idea, if you have a model and you just subdivide it, and then you will get, more polygons, and then you can start adjusting these lower subdivision. Um, well, really, that's a, that's me misspeaking. We would say that these are higher subdivision levels than this model or this version. So this would be subdiv level 0, and this would be number 1, and level 2, and level 3. And the fun thing about ZBrush and subdivision sculpting software is that you can sort of move back and forth between these levels and sort of sculpt on the level that makes most sense to you. Anyways, the fun thing is, subdivide model enough and you get a lot of polygons quite quickly, and you can start doing details like this. And that's the basic scheme for sculpting. Now there's more to it, but that's the first sort of the basis for it. Now, as usual, I won't spend much time going into actually showing you how ZBrush works. There's lots of tutorials out there. I just want to say this though. Well, I'll say other things as well, but having a clear goal or sort of how to approach ZBrush, um, it generally helps if you have a clear goal, because you can really get lost in the weeds with digital sculpting unless you have, again, a clear goal. And this is just, well, this isn't even a link. This is just an old screenshot. I've forgotten where it comes from, but you can, all the normal rules of setting up image planes and using reference still apply. And what we'll be talking about in this lecture is mostly about making the entire pipeline work, because digital sculpting, which I'll get to in a little bit, is like it's a whole thing. It's an art unto itself. And in this talk, I will mostly be talking about getting to the finish line, like which steps are involved here. A bit of terminology that may or may not be helpful to bear in mind is shapes, or, well, primary, secondary, and tertiary shapes, or tertiary, I guess you might say. Maybe that's how you actually pronounce it. And with the primary shapes, we're talking about the silhouette or the broad, like big shapes, like how you sort of break down and think about the design of a model. When we talk about secondary shapes, we're talking about the anatomy and sort of trying to figure out the function of the shapes, like what is this actually, why is it there, what's it doing. And with tertiary shapes, we're talking about the material or the surface or the surface texture of it all. And ZBrush generally, like, there's a lot of tools in ZBrush and different brushes, and it sort of helps when you start to realize that some of, like, if you sort of follow an approach of first working on the primary shapes and then the secondary and then the tertiary shapes, uh, things sort of become easier, and you don't want to, like, when you're working on just the primary silhouette of the model, then you have like tools like the thumbnail view that shows you a tiny thumbnail of just the silhouette of your model, and then all you do is focus on creating a great silhouette. And once you are happy with the silhouette, you move on to the secondary shapes. And once you're happy with the secondary shapes, then and only then do you care about how the surface textures actually look. And things really become a mess if you start to try to mix and match. It's really a best to do this uh, in a sort of linear fashion. But as I said, sculpting as such is really an art form unto itself. So I won't bother you too much about concepts about sculpting right now. I mean, sure, there's a lot of technical, functions you can find in ZBrush if you really want to go there. But you can basically think about ZBrush as a like just a digital version of actual sculpting, and you can do pretty much anything in ZBrush, just starting with a blob of clay, digital clay, and working on it until you get something, something like a model like this. That is definitely possible. You can get really far without getting particularly technical at all. Assuming you have a Wacom or a tablet, a drawing tablet with pressure sensitivity, you can just sort of while away. Um, but yeah, so what it really comes down to, and the important stuff really isn't the technical portion, but sort of the artistry and the approach and your knowledge about shape and form, really. And the number one way people have learned this for hundreds of years is studying anatomy. And that's why I want you to check out this video, Sculpting the Face with Ryan Kingsleen. He's a really cool guy, worth checking out. He has an online school as well, and that sort of this sort of thinking will be the basis to become a better sculptor, quite simply. But let's move on to the next portion, which is talking about how to go from high res or a digital sculpt to a low res or something that works in Maya, for instance. And another way to talk about that is to talk about retopologizing and baking stuff. And the process is essentially like for the entire workflow. Um, it probably will go something like this. You'll start with either a base mesh, like you can model a basic head in Maya or something else, or you can go to the wiki polycount .com here and find a base mesh. So if you need to sculpt a human, like there's a model you can just download, and well, a bunch of different models. So you can create a model before you go into ZBrush, or you can just sort of start from a sphere in ZBrush or start from Z spheres in ZBrush. You'll meet that workflow as well. And well, so there's various ways to work in ZBrush, but eventually you'll wind up with a high-res sculpt that you're happy with. Like you have a head and it looks good. The problem being that it will consist of a lot of tiny polygons. And if you try to bring that into Maya, Maya will just sort of crash. Well, not crash, but things will get slow and it's annoying. So what you will do is you will create a retopo or a low-res version of that model. You will retopologize it so you have a model with a nice, clean, simple topology and edge flow and all of that. And this one will be, this will be easy to UV map, which you need to do because then you can transfer the geometric details of the high res to the low res, but as a texture instead. And then you'll set that up in Maya with that texture so that in render time the details are reapplied, but only in render time and not until then. So that's the basic idea here. Having a bit of a closer look at just the retopo portion of this is, again, you might start with just a quick base mesh, something you create, and then you'll sculpt on that base mesh, like subdivide it until you start to realize that the model, the underlying topology doesn't really help you anymore. And you want to create shapes that just subdividing this and moving the resulting topology around just doesn't cut it anymore. And then eventually at some point you'll realize that you need to retopology to create a retopo. And maybe you can make it all the way until the end and you're sort of satisfied with the result you have. Or you realize like, we can retopo multiple times during a project. So we plan out the new topology or we create the new topology in some way. We can do it in a very manual way where we literally paint it out and select every single vertice's new position. Um, we'll get to that in just a little bit. But once we have a new topology, what we can actually do is to project. Like we don't necessarily have to just project it to textures. We can just project like the old details onto the new geometry. So we just have the same geometry but with a new topology, and that might make it easier to continue sculpting and continue detailing. And like in some cases, we'll do this as sort of a cycle as we sculpt. We might start with a very, very simple base mesh and we'll sculpt a little bit and we'll realize that the topology doesn't work anymore, it doesn't hold up, and we'll create a new topology and we'll project the old geometry to the new geometry as geometry, and we'll detail it and we'll repeat and repeat and repeat until we're happy. And that's the basic pipeline there. Digging into retopology then a little bit. So retopology in its most basic form means you have a high resolution base model or your sculpt, and you can bring that to Maya and just sit and manually place out new a new topology, just rebuild the mesh but with better edge flow. And that's one way to do it. And here's one video that is well, starting from sculptures, but the portion in Maya is the same. Of course, there's also on flip normals a lot of videos about this, so there's that. Um, so you can definitely create the retopo manually in Maya. There's also like, manual workflows in ZBrush, but there's also automatic tools in ZBrush that are well worth checking out. And I've actually added Decimate, which is more of a reduction thing, but yeah, let's focus on the three key ones for now. And what this image sort of represents. A little bit low res. I wonder if there's more here. And actually, in this article, you can read about even more ways to retopologize, but this would be like the basic ones. Okay, nope. I guess this is the resolution we get. So you can sort of see the difference in the topology in these three versions here. So we can imagine someone has sculpted a ring of some sort. This is. And in ZBrush, you'll find three buttons, one called Dynamesh, the other Decimate, and Z-Remesher. And this would be the result you get out of Dynamesh. So what Dynamesh does is really it's just projecting sort of the voxels. So you get a very even grid of the, well, yeah, you just get an even grid. That's what you get. Which is quite convenient when you're just sculpting freely and then maybe you're making some strange shape and the topology sort of gets weird and you just use Dynamesh. So that's very commonly used to just continue your sculpting. This is the result you'd expect out of decimation or decimation master. That's the option called. Uh, and what that does is to use triangles to create an as optimized model as possible. And this you would maybe use towards the end of a project when you want to export it out. Like in some cases, you can even do this, and this will just be your, say, your game model or the final model. It creates topology that's horrible to work with because everything is just sort of random, but it's very efficient at what it does. And this is the result you get from Z-Remesher. And you can sort of see here that it has tried to adapt the topology to the shape itself, sort of the way we would probably want to do it, especially if we want to animate it. Then Z-Remesher is the go-to option because it creates topology that just sort of works well when animating, and also if you want to keep sculpting, then this sort of helps to keep the shape. So those would be the three key automatic tools, and of course they're not fully automatic. You can read more about them here and in the documentation and elsewhere, and get more information on how to control them so they're more than just automatic. Um, if what you're trying to create is a final model that will be maybe animated or like it's important that it looks good, then often my approach is to use Z-remesher and try to control it quite well, and then send the result of that to Maya and clean it up even further in Maya. That's often my approach. Now, while creating a new topology, your retopology or your retopo or your low res, whatever, or your low poly, many words for the same thing, you might as well go ahead and also make sure it has UVs. So if you're modeling or creating the retopo in Maya, just go ahead and UV map it. And once you send it back to ZBrush, it will have UVs and things will just get easier. Um, Something that can also make your life easier is if you need to export or import stuff back and forth from Maya to ZBrush a lot. Um, like the manual way to do that would be to export OBJs or FBXs and like file import, file export all the time. And it can sort of be a hassle. A recommended workflow is to set up Gozi, which is just a one plugin. It comes with ZBrush, and it allows you to, with just one click, send models from Maya to ZBrush and back and forth. And yeah, that makes life easier. Something else that makes your life easier is that you can UV map stuff in ZBrush. There's a few different ways to do it, but the way pretty much everyone does it is using UV Master, which is fantastic. Really, it's a game changer, or was for me when it came out. That's maybe, well, okay, that was a while ago. But basically, you can throw pretty much any kind of model at it, and it will. I wonder if we ever see the result. It doesn't really matter. It automatically generates a UV layout for you. So definitely have a check out at the have a check. Check out UV Master for creating UVs. I mean, again, this might not generate a perfect result first time you click it, and even if you use the control methods, you might not become completely happy with it. Sometimes what I do is I like make a really bad UV, or I start on a UV in Maya, and then I send it to UV Master to let it sort of do the final bit of it, and then I'll maybe send it back to Maya and do the layout. But it's great for unfolding. And that's a quick note on, while on the topic of UVs, is you can actually use ZBrush for painting as well. And to paint on, well, the basic way to paint would involve, well, of course, you would need UVs. But actually, in ZBrush, there's a few different ways to paint your model. You can read all about it. But one that is maybe used even more than one requiring UVs is you can polypaint and basically create vertex colors or per vertex colors. And with millions of vertices, you can create quite detailed polypainting. So if you would like to colorize or texture your models, have a look at polypainting. And a really nice tool in ZBrush for texturing purposes is Spotlight. And what Spotlight essentially allows you to do is have a texture overlay and project that texture to your model, and some other stuff as well. But that's one of the things it allows you to do. So well worth checking out. Finally, worth mentioning is a plugin for ZBrush called ZAppLink. And what this does, it's sort of funky, but you can actually send your model to, say, Photoshop and sort of do your texturing in Photoshop as well. It's sort of a funky workflow and not that widely used because it has its ups and downs, but that might be interesting to check out if you want to explore. But the texturing stuff, that's sort of a side note. Let's get back to baking. And the basic idea here being we or you will have a high res model and you will have a low res model, and you will project the details from the high res to the low res in the shape of some form of map. And probably this will be a bump or displacement map, or a normal map, or maybe even a vector displacement map. We'll talk about all of those coming up next. And in ZBrush, you are limited to working on a single model and baking between the subdivision levels. So maybe you would decide that your subdiv level 0 is your low res, the one you want to use, and you will need to have the geometry details as a higher subdiv level, which is sort of straightforward, but in other software, we don't. We can project between completely different topologies, completely different models, and we can even project multiple models to a single low poly model and stuff like that. But we'll get to that. Sort of, this is maybe jumping ahead a little bit. We'll get back to this when we talk more about texturing, but like projecting normal or displacement, that's just one thing. We can project all kinds of geometric information, like how thick is it, and what's the curvature of the geometry, and stuff like that, and that can really uh, help speed up the texturing process. But we'll get back to that. Let's talk a little bit about how the baking or the projection actually works. And maybe, well, come to think of it, this image might be a little bit complex because it involves a few different things. But the basic idea is it's a form of projection. So we have our in-game mesh or our low poly version, and that's this pink thing here. And we have the high res, and that's that's the digital sculpt. And well, your low poly, of course, has its normals. And if what you're doing is creating a normal map, um, what you want to do is to basically project the in-game mesh normals, like project from that down until you find the high poly mesh, and just record what is the normal of the high poly at that pixel, and save that to a texture. And if what you're doing is saving out a displacement map, then all you're looking for is that's even simpler. You just want to know the distance, and that would be your displacement map. So this all sort of works based on the normals and projecting rays from them. Um, this seems simple, perhaps in principle, but in practice, you can find all kinds of weird problems with this, and something you can actually well, we can talk about cages slightly later. Actually, we come back to cages, and let's instead focus on some common issues and strategies. And one strategy I can cages is here now. Certain problems can appear, and one being, so if you're low poly model, and this is maybe more of a problem, not if you're working in just in ZBrush, but if you're baking in other software than ZBrush, which I'll talk a little bit about in a bit. Then if you have normals, like a hard edge normal, um, what you actually wind up with is like if you project this normal and that normal, you realize that you're actually getting these discontinuities. And even worse, you can wind up with repeated details. So, like, number one, you got to make sure that when the baking happens, uh, that this doesn't happen, and having smooth normals would be the way to go there. Um, Other common issues is ray misses, where the of course this is one example of ray misses. Another example would be if the high-res mesh is just like too far away, because like the farther you have to project and look for intersections, the slower things get. So we usually set a fairly low default option for how far these normals are sent out, and then you can get misses if the difference between the models is too great. And well, that runs into the problem that maybe you start reaching like the other side of the model or something like that, and so that also can become sort of a bit of an issue. And that's where actually creating a cage comes in. So a cage would actually be creating like creating a version of your low poly model that you manually move in and out to sort of show how far to trace the race. I don't really ever use cages, but if you really have some complicated um, baking issues, then maybe that could be something you can check out. Um, so, anyways, like the key point here is that baking errors is to be expected. Like that's everybody has baking issues. It never works perfectly the first time you try it, and it's just part of the workflow. If you would like a recipe for how to do it, and a recipe that works almost all the time, then check out this article that is about creating displacement maps from ZBrush into a few different um, options, but Arnold being the one you care about. So I think at some point here you can sort of select, yeah, so you're in ZBrush and you're using, there's a few different ways to generate displacement maps and exporting them out, and usually multi-map exporter is the way to go. And you select Arnold for Maya, and then you just do this stuff, and it usually turns out um, great. So make sure to have a look at that one. And let's talk a little bit more about baking options. And well, first, if that article there isn't enough for you, then here's another video about doing correctly exporting displacement from IAM and setting that up. And this Michael Wild guy, great guy, well worth checking out. And I hope I have set my notifications. Excellent. He's he's quite interesting as well, and good quality videos. So worth checking out. There's a bunch of other tools to do baking. You can learn more about it. You can do it in Maya. Maya can do baking, but it's sort of not that good at it. So I often wind up using Substance Designer, which we'll have a look at in a later lecture. But there's also even more specialized tools, like or tools that also offer baking. Like it's a very standard part of the workflow. So Marmoset tool bag or Nald or Xnormal or Handplane, like these are just some. We could list them for hours. So instead of that, let's talk about what we want to get out of this, or how to evaluate it. And you might remember from this video that maybe the key difference between bump, normal, and displacement is that displacement actually changes the silhouette, whereas bump and normal doesn't actually affect the silhouette. But all of them should be able to recreate the details, and normals just do it better than bump. We don't really talk about bump. We talk about normals and displacement. Anyways, what you want to do is so you have your high poly and you have your low poly and you have a low poly, and maybe it's a normal map or it's a displacement map. Either way, you want to like be able to do this comparison. And ideally, you should be confused like, wait, is this the low poly or is this the high poly? And only when you look really closely, you'll start to realize that, oh, this is like the silhouette here. The silhouette is still the same silhouette, but all the details have been successfully captured. And then you can say that, okay, so it was a successful operation. And this is the reason why we can see a lot of people putting up comparison images like this and sort of showing. I guess we can't actually see the actual high poly in this breakdown, and that makes me a little bit sad. But that's the reason why we want to see the low poly and the result um, to be able to like evaluate that everything went the way we planned it to. So let's now talk about the maps that we generally create when baking. And I'm not sure why I even leave bump in here. It's uh, like you could create a displacement map and use it as a bump map. I'm not sure why you would do that, because if you don't want a displacement map, you'll probably get a normal map. Bump is really mostly just if you find some random textures and you just want to throw them in there, and random black and white textures, then you use that as a bump. But if you're baking things from a high poly, then normal map is the way to go for games, and displacement map is the way to go for film. I mean, you can mix it if you want, but that's sort of the simple way to go about it. But just as a refresher, like bump mapping being essentially perturbing or modifying the normals of the actual model based on looking at a black and white image and sort of figuring out an average, or like the slope of the intensity change of the values, uh, and that would become the bump. Whatever. That's this is the result you get out of bump mapping. An interesting side note of this is that because this works based on like you have to have a slope or you have to have a gradation for bump mapping to be visible. So if you plug in a texture like this, uh, sort of a little bit depending on your filter settings and sampling and whatnot, you can wind up with not being able to see anything because this is just there's no slope. It's just perfect edits. So this wouldn't work that well as a bump map. That's all I'm saying. So let's focus on displacement maps where it's not affecting the normals so much as offsetting the geometry in the normal direction. So this is the source mesh, you have a displacement map, and you get a displaced mesh. Fun fact, you can actually do this in Maya in the viewport real time, and you can also uh, like use displacement maps to generate models in Maya. That might take a little bit of a time, but you can sort of output so you actually have geometry in Maya that you can work with based on a displacement map. Anyways, usually we do that in render time instead, and it's obviously slower than bump mapping, but it actually changes the silhouette. But in order to actually change the silhouette or do so in like to capture the details of the models, we'll probably need to subdivide or tessellate the model. Like if you see this, this is a very low res sphere. You can see uh, the topology. For displacement mapping to make sense, we generally need to also tessellate the model. And I thought I would talk a little bit about some interesting issues or common issues that can result. The number one being ballooning, and you have a model like this, and you have some sort of displacement map you think makes sense, but you wind up with a balloon animal. And the reason for this, the common reason for this, is considering what the mid value is. So when you're displacing, or when the displacement happens, like you would generally imagine, like you have an image like this, and you would expect like the white portions to go out, and then you would expect the black portions to go in. And that would mean that your mid value would be 0.5, like mid gray. That should be the not affected portion of the image. Um, and that's sort of the way to do it if what you what you find is like just an image like this, and you just want to use this as a displacement map, then you would want to set the 0.5. What generally happens though, if you're baking in ZBrush and you're baking out like EXRs or TIFFs, and they're 16 or 32-bit TIFFs, then 32-bit images, or like floating point images, they can actually store negative values. Like this is just JPEG, or if you download it, maybe it's a PNG. But EXRs can actually have negative values. So in those files, the mid value will actually be 0. And yeah, so when you input the displacement map, you need to know like what is the mid value of this texture really supposed to be. And yep, so that's number one. That's the balloon animals. Related to this is like having the proper scale of the displacement. This usually isn't a problem if you're doing the baking in ZBrush, and it's a 32-bit image, and basically the proper scale, or how far everything should be pushed out, is encoded in the value of the model itself. That can become a problem if you start to rescale the model in Maya, and maybe you also need to freeze transforms in Maya in order to notice that suddenly your displacement isn't displacing as much. So that's also worth keeping in mind. Like if you want to be quite correct and like recreate the model you had in ZBrush in Maya, then having the proper scale matters as well. And finally, bit depth. And I think this image sort of shows the problem that can appear if you have 8-bit images or even 16-bit images as displacement, is you can get this stair-stepping effect. So generally with displacement maps, 16-bit or 32-bit is the way to go. Let's talk a little bit more about issues related to displacement maps. And one thing to be aware of, again, like your model will need to be tessellated, right, and have more geometry in order to capture all the detail of the displacement map. But subdivision or tessellation, or we've seen two different ways we can do that: the linear or the Cat-Clark smoothing, and Cat-Clark smoothing being the default sort of presumption when it comes to this. So what this means is actually when a displacement map is being baked in ZBrush, unless you like make an effort to change the defaults, it will actually assume that the model to be displaced isn't like, if you have a cube and you want to displace it, or you have a displacement map, it will actually assume that the model that will in fact be displaced will be more of a sphere. And that means, and that's the reason why we can often sort of see this this pattern, right, of the well, on the displacement map, right, we can actually see the faces, and they're sort of darker and whiter, and it has to do with basically needing to not just capture the difference between the low poly and the high poly, but actually the subdivided low poly that doesn't actually exist when the baking happens, but it sort of is inferred. So that can sort of throw you for a loop sometimes. And I tend to call this a displacement map. Like if you make an effort, you can actually sort of get the baker to assume that this is the model that is going to receive the displacement map instead of this. And I tend to call that a height map and not a displacement map, just so I have terminology to keep them apart. Other issues that might appear include splitting or like, uh, seeing seams like this. And this generally, well, I mean, if you have a cube and you displace each side in the direction of their normals, then you're gonna get splits because, well, of course you are. And well, the solution to this generally means like you have to make sure that to soften the normals essentially, so that it can project in the direction of the normals while being just a cube. Or you can add a bunch of bevels and stuff. But basically, smooth normals is usually the safest option to go with. And we've already talked about these images. And yeah, so that's that about displacement issues. When it comes to solutions, I've already mentioned this article and another YouTube video. Can also mention this YouTube video. This is Flip Normals, not Michael Wild's approach to the same thing. I guess my point being here that there's a bunch of good tutorials out there for how to do this in an accurate way. And you want to make sure that you get it right, that you can have a model in ZBrush that's quite complicated, and you can recreate that model in Maya and it just looks the same. Because if it doesn't look the same, well, then what was the point of having that nice model in ZBrush? You want to be able to have all that detail in Maya as well. Let's now talk about normals. And normal mapping, maybe you will mostly use this in games, although you can use this for sure for film as well. Doesn't really, I mean, of course, it works either way. So in normals, what the colors actually signify, like you always get these blue colorful images, and what they signify is just a new normal or a vector or a direction um, in a tangent space, and that's just saved as three values, and it happens to look like a texture or an image, but really it's just a bunch of directions being saved, and that's that, and that's quite convenient. Like in games, this can actually be more efficient because in a bump map, for instance, you need to do some sort of calculating to figure out what the new normal will be because you have to look at the average of the slope and whatnot. But this is just, sample the pixel and that's the new normal, at least in in the most common way we use it. So normals, when they look this way, are in the tangent coordinate space or the normal coordinate space of each vertex, or really each point on a model. Again, widely used in games, but it can also be engine specific, and I'll get into the issues related to normal maps well next. So two quite basic issues when it comes to normal maps is well, what kind of normal is this? Uh, or in which space is it being defined? And the standard almost always, especially, and it has to be this if it's being animated, the mesh, it's at the normal is in tangent space. And basically that means that the normals are relative to the surface itself. Whereas if you get this like very colorful rainbow look, then what you have is normals being defined in world space. That is, well, not relative to the mesh itself, just completely ignoring the mesh's own normals, and the normals in the texture is precisely the normal that you will get as defined in world space. So that's the key difference there, and pretty much all normals these days are in tangent space. Something that can throw you off, and this is if you're working in games, because there are more, but there are two main render APIs or sort of underlying technologies when it comes to game or real-time renderers, and it's OpenGL and DirectX. And basically, they have this difference that they have flipped the Y channel, that would be the green channel, and it's just inverted. And that's it. So if you have something that looks good in an OpenGL render and then you put that normal map into a DirectX renderer, you have to flip the green channel, or the X, Y, Z, uh, the Y channel. But even further than that, there's some issues related to normals, and that is sort of the game or the engine specific, or it can be engine specific, which is the binormal and bitangents. So it's one thing just having a normal, and well, that's good, but you need two more to actually make sense of, like, well, what do these values, like, where should this new normal actually be pointing in world space? And what's sort of funny is that for optimization reasons, quite often the binormal and tangent aren't saved as their own pieces of data. They're sort of inferred from just saving the normal. Because for most applications, you don't really need to save this as its own thing. It's just extra data. Doesn't really matter unless what you're doing is um, normal mapping, in which case it does matter. In which case, many programs will just recalculate tangent and binormal because it's not that hard to do, but you can do it in different ways, and that can cause issues. And that's one of the reasons why the most complicated thing you can bake a normal map for is a cube, or in this case, like multiple cubes all stacked onto each other. So if you want like the long version and the details of how to actually generate perfect normal maps, then this article is the way to go. And it's quite a long article, and it gets into the weeds of all the details, like OpenGL plus or negative Y, and all of that. So there's a lot of details there. But basically, many engines or renderers this nowadays uses something that's called MICT space, which is just how to define or generate the tangents, really, and some renderers don't. And it sort of becomes important that when the normal map is being baked, that you know about how the final, like how the renderer expects those normals to be defined. So you can make sure that you have a synced normals workflow, that you bake normals in the same way that you will later render those normals. And if you want to render normal maps in Arnold, that's actually a little bit convoluted. And I think I actually have, yeah, this is sort of a test I do every now and then when I'm going to a new render, is I actually create a sphere and I light it with three red-green lights, and they're orthogonal to each other. So I basically sort of see a normal map like um, result, and uh, and that sort of helps me make sure that my normals aren't inverted or things like that. That's my experiment. And something if you want proper normals in Arnold, like if you pick a standard surface shader and you go to the geometry thing and you just plug in a normal map, it will generate a Maya default bump 2D node to plug the normal map into. But actually, you'll need to replace that with an AI normal map node. I'm not sure why, it just works better. You will get more correct results, which is something you'll see more about if you click on this video and check it out. Moving on, let's talk about vector displacement maps for just a little bit. And what vector displacement maps are is basically normal maps and displacement maps combined, but even freakier and allowing you to do this kind of stuff. And like regular displacement maps just go up and down, that's it. Whereas vector displacements start to, you can create this sort of overlaps or mushrooms or ears. So it's way cooler, It's really cool, but it also comes with a lot of issues. And if you want to set it up in Maya, like the whole synced normals workflow becomes 10 times more involved. I mean, you can just figure it out. I actually don't remember anymore how to set this up in Maya because I don't really ever use it. But um, it's definitely doable. It's just you gotta be quite precise and make sure that you use the right settings for the right render. What's good to keep in mind though is like if you're creating displacement maps and maybe you have a normal map and you have some vector displacement map, like we can combine these, right? We don't force ourselves to just use one of them. We maybe we sculpt a little bit and we have a nice displacement map, and then we stumble across a cool normal map and we realize, oh, I would like to just add this on top, and yeah, let's just go right ahead and add that on top. And actually, displacement maps aren't even plugged into the like the normal surface shader. It's displacement maps go straight into um, the shading group, so they're their own sort of shader. But if you need to string maybe bumps and normal maps together, then that's exactly what you do. You just feed the out value from one normal map into the in normal of another normal map, and that just works out. And if you would like to have a bit more detail on working with that, then this article is also quite interesting when it comes to that. Or interesting and interesting. I mean, it just shows you the basic how to how to do it. It's not rocket science. All right. Finally, I would like to sort of turn things around. We've talked so far about like, the idea here being you have a high poly model and you're baking that detail to textures so you can use that in Maya. Excellent. But you can actually flip the workflow around and start sculpting with textures. Now, that's pretty that's pretty straightforward. You might do that like all the time. Maybe you like as in Photoshop, you can create your own brushes and just black and white stuff, and you can start brushing away in ZBrush. And that's quite convenient if you want to do like skin or all kinds of little details. And you can even find textures like like this, like human skin textures, for instance, and download a displacement map and use this as an alpha and like, well, paint out skin in ZBrush on your model, and then you get even cooler ZBrush models, and you can then you would eventually bake that stuff to a texture. So of course you don't necessarily have to like if you have a texture like this, maybe you don't need to put that on the model because it is already a texture, so you can just apply it as a texture later on, again using the layering ideas from here. And yeah, but some cool things can happen if you um, well have a look at a few ways to work in ZBrush, which is number one in ZBrush. If you have sculpted um, detail in ZBrush, and I can actually open this video, I think, and okay, fine. Oh, really? Vimeo. The basic idea being in ZBrush is if you sculpt something like this, you can actually turn the sculpt, the thing that you're looking at, uh, basically into displacement map just by clicking a nice little button called Grab Dock. And I guess they maybe do that earlier somewhere. Uh, but that gives you your sculpt as a as an alpha, and basically you can start painting out that sculpt like just onto your model like that. So that's pretty cool. Grab Dock to create alphas from sculpture. Um, or you can like the same idea, but you can actually rather than just a normal boring alpha, you can create vector displacement alphas. So you actually like you can start creating vector displacement maps from pretty much anything, and before you know it, you're drawing out ears and weird shapes, or shapes like this, and you can just sort of create that as a stamp. And once you start sculpting, you can just have a bunch of little shapes like that. Yay! So that's pretty cool if you're doing strange sculpting details and you need to repeat them. And a final sort of idea when it comes to this whole textures, displacements, back and forth workflow is, if you have textures like this, you can actually texture your character like normally and just apply the textures. Um, you can do that kind of texturing in ZBrush. You can do it in, we'll mostly have a look at Substance, but another software commonly used is Mari for texturing. And if you do it in Mari, so you have these kinds of details or a texture that looks like this, and you can sort of preview it as a bump map, but then you can send that to ZBrush and actually make actual geometry out of that, and then sort of use the textures as a guide and keep working on them in ZBrush to maybe enhance some details and maybe make them even better. And that can be a quite convenient workflow, especially if you're doing stuff like this where there's like a quite defined a defined but sort of also very organic texture uh, that is really really annoying to sculpt just by hand, uh, but is also maybe a little bit too complicated to just sort of hope a texture like this will capture it. You might need to, well, combine texturing and sculpting for maximum results. Finally, let's have a look at photogrammetry. And photogrammetry is, well, it's a way to scan models. And it's not the only way to scan models. And let's just briefly, give honorary mentions to, for instance, LiDAR, which is basically having a little bit of a machine here that spins around and sends out a laser or lots of lasers, and basically scans the environment with measuring the time it takes for that to come back. So that's LiDAR. Another method is structured light projection, which we'll talk a little bit about later on. Um, but basically, that works by projecting a sort of, well, a known structure of light and sort of photographing that from various angles, and that sort of helps you figure out the underlying geometry. But the method like used, for instance, by Quixel Megascans and for most uses really in the CG industry is photogrammetry, where we'll just photograph a subject from a bunch of different angles, throw that into a piece of software that will throw out a 3D model. That's pretty neat. And there's a bunch of different photogrammetry software out there. There's even mobile apps just for your phone. iPhone is quite, or Apple is quite active in that department. Really, you can create quite great models just by holding your phone and waving it around. But a few slightly more, well, desktop oriented ones is Sketchfab. That's, well, no, why am I Sketchfab? That's just a website. We're talking about Meshroom, Alice Vision Meshroom. That's um, a free piece of software, so that's great. Yay, that. So that's always a good option. My personal favorite, because I've worked with it a fair bit, is Agasoft Metashape, which we sadly don't have licenses for, but you can request a trial, and I think it's a 30-day trial, and you can check that out. Another quite prominent photogrammetry software in the industry is Reality Capture, which actually also has the option of working Like it does the calculating business on the cloud if you wanted to, and that can be good because especially when like photogrammetry, like people will start taking hundreds or even thousands of photos, and that can take quite a long time to calculate. So that's that's a point in favor of cloud-based ones. Whereas if you have a powerful machine already, then you can just do it locally. The basic idea of photogrammetry is actually something that's been used for quite a time in the VFX industry for uh, tracking cameras, because that's really what we need to do. We have a bunch of different cameras, and we need to figure out, or well, photos, but essentially cameras, and we need to figure out their position relative to one another. So the number one step in any photogrammetry software is feature detection and matching, and sort of um, well, it will start out by seeding a bunch of points or selecting a few points here and there in an image, and in the next image try to find um, those same points and then repeat that process for a bunch or for all the photos and try to align them all up with one another and try to figure that out. So inherent in that is that most photogrammetry software really does this on their own. They need to figure out the camera information, like the focal length and like the lens distortion and things like that about the camera, which the software generally do on their own. Although it's always best to make sure that the photos you put into a photogrammetry application retain their original metadata. Because for most cameras, if you're using a remotely decent camera to take photos with, it will actually save, and maybe this is the most important number, the focal length of the camera being used. Um, and that sort of helps um, with the reconstruction. So the first step is just matching up the cameras, and then once that has been done to some degree of success, then per pixel, or maybe not necessarily per pixel, but we'll start to reconstruct the details more. Well, more details will be reconstructed, but the first step is always to figure out the cameras. Of course, much of the skill of photogrammetry happens before you throw it into a piece of software. And it's really about how to photograph things and realizing maybe that some things don't work that well for photogrammetry. For instance, very reflective objects like cars and glass and well, transparent things, that becomes quite tricky when trying to scan them. And there's actually like specialized sprays and stuff you can put on objects to make them less reflective. But when you start out, maybe like focus on trees and stones and other objects that aren't so shiny. And once you realize, by the way, that a very key element to be able to reconstruct something is to see from different angles. Only then can we sort of triangulate their position. And for that reason, you mustn't stand like still in a single point and shoot out. You want to walk around as much as possible so you get a parallax shift or a shift in position uh, as you photograph something. And I mean, you can get really into the details of this. Obviously, handheld isn't really a great idea, preferably using a tripod and preferably being as fast as possible because if you're outdoors or something, like conditions change. And if you want a lot of details about this, then um, the Unity photogrammetry workflow um, book sort of goes into, well, everything. So this is one resource I can recommend checking out. perhaps the key reason I bring this up in a lecture that's mostly about sculpting is, well, the thing or the result you get out of the camera matching and, well, the point cloud generation, it will generate a mesh for you in the end, and that mesh might not be perfect. Actually, I think we're looking at just the point cloud right now, but once this is turned into a mesh, it will have all these weird floating bits, and you'll have parts missing, and like the underside of everything that will be missing. So eventually we'll have to clean that up, and we mostly do that in ZBrush and to manage those kinds of projects. And once you send something into ZBrush, like, there's a slightly unique problems that come with um, a photogrammetry model like this. But once you're in here, basically it's just ZBrush, just a high-res model, and it's time to sculpt away and just make this model a nice looking model. And once it is a nice looking model inside of ZBrush, it's just normal high-res, low-res pipeline. So you want to do retopology and all of that to get going. So actually, this video is a quite that's quite nice to check out, even if you're just doing sculpting, because some of the tools in there, like, there's a lot of overlap between sculpting and cleaning up a sculpt. And just a quick note of what's perhaps obvious, but when photo scanning, of course, you're actually getting the textures as well, the albedo textures, and that's pretty great. So something that many of these tools like Agasoft and also Unity and whatnot. Unity is game engine, by the way, but they have a lot of just random tools, or useful tools rather. Anyways, uh, they also come with tools to manage these textures and to try to remove lighting and create, good albedo textures. And so that's often good to check out. If you're photo scanning something, have a look if the piece of software can help you delight. Otherwise, you might do the delighting in Photoshop, which definitely works, but these are specialized for that specific task. So that might be, your number one approach. And just sort of a fun um, thing. Oh, do I have that? All right, I can find the link in just a little bit. Or actually, let's do it right now. Boy and a Kite demo. That was something the Epic created. And if we just sort of add photogrammetry to this, yeah, 2 hour long talk about this. And they also have shorter versions of this where they talk about how they created this. I'm not sure that they ever really showed the result. Yeah, they made a short movie. It was quite nice, but again, this was a few years ago. Uh, but that sort of helped photogrammetry also like reach a bigger audience. But something they did here, and it's somewhere in this video, I'm just going to put it in there as a quick reference to delight geometry. So what they did was, so they photoscanned a model, right? And they also, we haven't really talked about this yet, but we will talk about it eventually. They recreated the lighting from that spot. So they used these light probes or these chrome balls to sort of figure out the lighting conditions. And then they recreated the lighting very precisely, and they essentially relit the CG object with the proper lighting and used that information to delight the textures that they got. Now that's like, that might sound like, oh, that makes sense, but that's just a preposterously difficult workflow. I cannot believe they actually did that, but it's a fun idea, which is why I mentioned it. And yeah, that covers that. And that brings me to the end of this video about sculpting. So Obviously, the core or the big portion you might want to focus on is the actual digital sculpting itself, and like getting a good approach and working with the shapes, and like just learning how to sculpt, right? That will be the number one priority, and it should be. With that said, though, unless you can bring your sculpts into Maya, and that would involve the whole high-res, low-res pipeline and retopo and baking. If you can't do that, and if you can't do it precisely, so that like all the details you created in ZBrush look the same in Maya, then what good was that sculpture, right? So make sure that you have a pipeline for actually getting your models out of ZBrush and into Maya, and that pipeline will revolve around normal maps and or displacement maps and possibly even vector displacement maps. That's if you're feeling fancy. Sculpting takes a long time to get good at, and the way to just cheat is photogrammetry. If what you're doing isn't like a dragon that doesn't, exist conveniently for you, but if all you need is like a rock, then photogrammetry is really, really the way to go. To just photo scan it and like skip a few steps of the sculpting pipeline and just wind up somewhere towards the end of the sculpting pipeline, clean up the model, and then do some final touches, and that will get you a model um, and the texture very, very conveniently. So photogrammetry, real fun to check out.